The smell hits me first. That metallic, processed odor that I know better than anyone else in this room. My daughter-in-law Chelsea stands in my kitchen doorway, her perfectly manicured nails gripping a dented can like it's a weapon, her smile sharp enough to cut glass. The label faces away from me, but I don't need to see it. I've spent 43 years perfecting that exact formula, that precise blend of chicken byproducts and preservatives that's made Jackson Premium Pet Foods a household name across North America. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Well, Minnie Mae, Chelsea's voice drips with false sweetness as she sets the can down on my own kitchen counter with a deliberate thunk. Since you're always complaining about the grocery bill and how expensive everything is these days, I thought you might appreciate something more economical for dinner tonight. My son Trevor hovers behind her like a guilty shadow, his eyes fixed on the worn linoleum floor of the modest rental house they've insisted I move into after selling what they believed was my only asset, my small suburban home. He won't meet my gaze, this man I raised with my own 2 hands after his father walked out when Trevor was 7. The same boy who used to help me in the garage, mixing the first experimental batches of pet food that would eventually build an empire worth $300 million. Go ahead, Mother Jackson, Chelsea continues, emphasizing the formal title she's insisted on since their wedding 3 years ago, never just calling me Minnie Mae like family should. Open it up. I picked out the best flavor they had, chicken and rice. Very nutritious, according to the label. The silence in the small kitchen stretches like a taut wire. Through the window, I can see the neighbors going about their evening routines in this working-class neighborhood where Chelsea and Trevor have relocated me, telling everyone it's temporary while they help me get back on my feet. What they don't know is that I own the manufacturing plant that produces the very cat food now sitting on my counter. What they don't know is that the humble grandmother they've been systematically humiliating for months controls the largest privately owned pet food distribution network in the country. 3 hours earlier, I had been sitting in my Toyota Corolla outside the law offices of Patterson, Williams & Associates, holding a manila folder containing documentation that could change everything. Inside that folder were the transfer papers I'd been preparing for months, documents that would shift controlling interest of Jackson Premium Pet Foods from the intricate web of trusts and shell companies I've maintained for decades back into my legal name. For years, I've allowed the world to believe that Minnie Mae Jackson was just another working-class grandmother, surviving on Social Security and the occasional odd job. The truth is far more complex. My story begins 45 years ago, in the tiny kitchen of a trailer park in Bakersfield, California, where I lived with my infant son Trevor, and a determination that burned brighter than the desert sun. Trevor's father had disappeared into the night, leaving behind nothing but empty beer bottles and a stack of unpaid bills. I was 22 years old, with a high school education and a baby who needed everything I couldn't afford to give him. The idea came to me during one of those desperate late nights when Trevor was teething and I was walking the floors, trying to soothe his crying. Our neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, had mentioned that her ancient poodle, Princess, had been refusing to eat the expensive prescription diet food the veterinarian recommended. The dog was losing weight, and Mrs. Rodriguez was spending her grocery money on specialty pet food that Princess wouldn't touch. I had always been good with cooking, learned from my grandmother, who could make magic happen with whatever scraps were available. That night, I found myself in my tiny kitchen, experimenting with combinations of chicken liver, rice, and vegetables, trying to create something that would appeal to a finicky old dog. When I brought the mixture to Mrs. Rodriguez the next morning, Princess devoured it like she hadn't eaten in weeks. Word spread through the trailer park with the speed of wildfire. Soon, I was preparing custom meals for half a dozen pets, charging just enough to buy Trevor's diapers and keep the lights on. The pet owners were thrilled to have an affordable alternative to expensive commercial food, and I discovered I had an intuitive understanding of animal nutrition that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Within 6 months, I was operating out of my kitchen with a waiting list of customers. Within a year, I had rented a small commercial space and hired 2 employees. By the time Trevor was 5, Jackson Premium Pet Foods was supplying independent pet stores across 3 counties. The growth was exponential and carefully calculated. I reinvested every penny back into the business, living as modestly as possible while building something that could give Trevor opportunities I never had. I studied animal nutrition through correspondence courses, learned business management from library books, and developed distribution networks through sheer persistence and the quality of my products. But I also learned something else during those early years. I learned that people treated me differently when they knew I had money. Neighbors who had been genuine friends became calculating and opportunistic. Men who had never noticed the single mother in the trailer park suddenly appeared with flowers and promises when word got out that my little pet food company was turning a profit. Most painfully, I watched how money changed the people closest to me. When Trevor was 8, I made the mistake of mentioning to my sister Linda that the business was doing well. Within a month, Linda had moved her entire family to California, expecting me to support them. When I set boundaries, she accused me of being selfish and ungrateful for family. The experience taught me that financial success could be as isolating as poverty, just in different ways. That's when I made the decision that would define the next 4 decades of my life. I would build my empire in the shadows, using trusts, holding companies, and legal structures that would allow Jackson Premium Pet Foods to grow, while keeping Minnie Mae Jackson invisible. To the world, I would remain the hard-working single mother who had gotten lucky with a small local business. The real scope of what I was building would be known only to a handful of lawyers, accountants, and business partners who were bound by confidentiality agreements. By the time Trevor graduated high school, Jackson Premium Pet Foods was operating in 12 states. By the time he finished college, we were international. By the time he married Chelsea, I was quietly overseeing an operation that employed over 2,000 people and generated annual revenues that would have shocked anyone who knew me as the grandmother who clipped coupons and shopped at thrift stores. The irony was perfect and terrible. I had built this empire to give Trevor security and opportunities, but the very secrecy that protected our wealth also allowed him to see me as a burden, rather than the source of everything he took for granted. The modest lifestyle I maintained wasn't poverty, it was camouflage, but Trevor and Chelsea had begun to see it as failure. The decline in their respect had been gradual, but unmistakable. It started with small comments about my fixed income and suggestions that I might be more comfortable in a smaller place. It escalated to conversations about my future security and whether I had planned adequately for my retirement. They spoke about me as if I were a child who couldn't manage my own affairs, never suspecting that their comfortable suburban lifestyle was possible, only because of the dividends I quietly provided through a family trust they believed was a small inheritance from a distant relative. 3 months ago, they had presented me with what they called a solution. Chelsea had found a darling little rental house in a much more affordable neighborhood, where I could live independently while being close enough for us to help when you need it. The house was indeed small, a 2-bedroom bungalow in a working-class area where most of my neighbors were genuinely struggling to make ends meet. They had presented the move as a kindness, a way to help me downsize and live within my means. What they didn't realize was that I owned the house. I owned the entire block, actually, purchased through one of my holding companies as part of a community development project I'd been quietly funding for years. The rent they believed I was paying to some anonymous landlord was actually going into a community fund that provided scholarships for local children and support for elderly residents who couldn't afford basic maintenance on their homes. The neighborhood had become my sanctuary in ways that my expensive suburban house never had. My neighbors here were genuine, their kindness uncomplicated by calculations about what I might be worth to them. Mrs. Patterson next door brought me vegetables from her garden and never made me feel like charity case. Mr. Williams across the street helped me with minor repairs and refused payment, simply saying that neighbors look out for each other. But Chelsea and Trevor saw only the surface. The modest houses, the older cars, the working-class demographics, and interpreted my presence here as evidence of decline rather than choice. Their visits became exercises in barely concealed condescension, filled with comments about making the best of your situation and, quote, staying positive despite everything. The cat food incident had been building for weeks. Chelsea had been making increasingly pointed comments about my grocery bills, expressing concern about my protein intake and whether I was eating enough. She had started bringing me food from their pantry, expired items, dented cans, things she claimed to have overbought, but which I recognized as the kind of damaged goods that get sold at steep discounts. Last week, she had brought me a bag of day-old bread from the bakery outlet, presenting it as if she had discovered a treasure. "Minnie Mae, you have to be more practical about these things," she had said, her voice filled with the patient tone people use with children. "There's no shame in being economical. We're all feeling the pinch these days." The truth was that I could have bought their entire subdivision without affecting my monthly budget.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
The Jackson Premium Pet Foods empire generated more profit in a single quarter than most people see in a lifetime. But I had maintained my modest lifestyle for so long that it had become a kind of armor, protecting me from the complications that came with visible wealth. Sitting in my lawyer's office that afternoon, reviewing the papers that would reveal my true financial status, I had felt a mixture of anticipation and sadness. The anticipation came from imagining the look on Chelsea's face when she discovered who she had been patronizing. The sadness came from knowing that once the truth was revealed, my relationship with Trevor would never be the same. The son I had protected from the pressures of wealth would have to reconcile his vision of his struggling mother with the reality of his incredibly successful parent. But the cat food sitting on my kitchen counter had made the decision for me. There was a line between allowing people to underestimate you and allowing them to dehumanize you, and Chelsea had crossed it with her characteristic precision. "Well," Chelsea's voice cut through my reverie, her perfectly applied lipstick stretched into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Aren't you going to thank me? This is premium stuff. I checked the price, and it's actually quite expensive for pet food. Very generous protein content." I looked at my son, still avoiding eye contact, his hands shoved deep in his pockets like a guilty child. This was the boy I had worked 18-hour days to support, who had attended private school and elite summer camps, funded by profits from the very industry Chelsea was now mocking. This was the young man who had graduated debt-free from Stanford, because I had quietly paid his tuition through a scholarship program I had established specifically for that purpose. "Chelsea," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the anger building in my chest, "I think there's been a misunderstanding." Her eyebrows rose in mock surprise. "A misunderstanding? Minnie Mae, I'm trying to help you here. I know money is tight, and I thought you might appreciate something nutritious and affordable. There's no need to be proud about these things." I walked slowly to the counter and picked up the can, turning it so I could see the label clearly. Jackson Premium Pet Foods, Gourmet Chicken and Rice Recipe. Premium Indoor Cat Formula. The familiar logo I had designed myself 30 years ago stared back at me. The stylized J intertwined with a paw print that had become one of the most recognizable symbols in the pet food industry. "This is an interesting choice," I said, running my finger along the label. "Jackson Premium? Do you know anything about this company, Chelsea?" She shrugged dismissively. "Some pet food manufacturer. I picked it because it looked like better quality than the cheap stuff. Even if you're eating cat food, it might as well be the good kind." The casual cruelty of her words hit me like a physical blow. Even if you're eating cat food. This wasn't just about money or economics. This was about power and humiliation, about reducing me to something less than human in her eyes and in my son's. "Trevor," I said, turning to face him directly, "do you have anything to say about this?" He finally looked up, his face flushed with embarrassment and something that might have been shame. "Mom, Chelsea is just trying to help. She knows you're worried about expenses, and she thought I should eat cat food," I finished for him. "Your wife thought your mother should eat cat food, and you're standing there letting it happen." "It's not like that," Trevor said quickly, but his voice lacked conviction. "It's just, you're always talking about how expensive everything is, and Chelsea was trying to find alternatives." "Alternatives to human food," I said softly. "Alternatives that involve your mother eating food designed for cats." Chelsea's smile faltered slightly, but she recovered quickly. "Minnie Mae, you're being dramatic. It's just food." Probably healthier than half the processed junk you buy at the grocery store. And certainly more economical. I set the can down carefully and walked to the kitchen drawer where I kept important papers. From beneath a stack of utility bills and grocery store circulars, I withdrew the manila folder I had brought back from the lawyer's office. The folder that contained documents that would change everything. Chelsea. Trevor. I think it's time we had a conversation about economics, I said, placing the folder on the kitchen table. About alternatives and about what exactly I can and cannot afford. Chelsea's eyes narrowed slightly as she looked at the folder, some instinct warning her that the power dynamic in the room was shifting in ways she didn't understand. Trevor looked confused, his attention shifting between the folder and my face, trying to read an expression he hadn't seen from me in years. "What's that, Mom?" Trevor asked, his voice cautious. "This," I said, opening the folder and spreading the documents across the table, "is the truth about your mother's financial situation. The truth about who I really am and what I've been doing for the past 43 years while you thought I was just getting by." The first document was a corporate ownership statement from Jackson Premium Pet Foods, showing my controlling interest in the company. The second was a financial statement from my investment portfolio. The third was a property deed for their own house, which they had always believed they owned, but which was actually held in trust for them through one of my holding companies. Chelsea leaned forward to read the documents, her face going pale as she processed the numbers and legal language. Trevor picked up the ownership statement, his eyes widening as he recognized the name of the company whose products filled pet stores across the country. "I don't understand," Chelsea whispered, her voice suddenly small and uncertain. "This says you own Jackson Premium Pet Foods. But that's impossible. That company is worth $312 million, according to the most recent valuation," I said calmly. "Though that doesn't include our international holdings or the real estate portfolio." Trevor was staring at me as if he had never seen me before. "Mom, what is this? How is this possible?" I walked back to the counter and picked up the can of cat food, holding it so they could both see the label clearly. "This is Jackson Premium Pet Foods Gourmet Chicken and Rice Recipe. I developed this particular formula in 1987, when you were 12 years old, Trevor. The chicken is sourced from farms in North Carolina that meet our specific standards for antibiotic-free, free-range poultry. The rice is enriched with vitamins and minerals that promote healthy coat shine and digestive health in indoor cats." Chelsea's mouth had fallen open, her carefully constructed composure crumbling as she began to understand the magnitude of what had just been revealed. The protein content that Chelsea mentioned is exactly 28%, which we determined through extensive testing to be optimal for adult indoor cats with moderate activity levels, I continued, my voice taking on the tone I used in board meetings with distributors and investors. The price point she referenced reflects our position as a premium brand, commanding approximately 30% higher margins than our closest competitors. I set the can down and looked directly at Chelsea, whose face had gone from pale to ashen. "What you've just suggested, my dear daughter-in-law, is that I eat a product that I spent 4 decades perfecting, manufactured in facilities that I own, distributed through networks that I built, and sold in stores that carry my products because of relationships I've cultivated with retailers across 3 countries. Trevor was still holding the ownership documents, his hands shaking slightly. "Mom, I don't understand. If you own all this, why are you living here? Why did you sell the house? Why do you act like you're struggling?" "Because 43 years ago, I learned that money changes people, Trevor. I learned that when people know you have wealth, they stop seeing you as a person and start seeing you as an opportunity. I learned that even family members can become calculating and manipulative when they think there's something to gain." I looked around the small kitchen, with its modest appliances and discount store dinnerware, and felt a surge of protective affection for the life I had built here. This house, this neighborhood, this lifestyle. It's not poverty, Trevor. It's freedom. Freedom from people who want to use me. Freedom from the expectations that come with visible wealth. Freedom to find out who really cares about me and who just cares about what I can do for them. Chelsea had sunk into one of the kitchen chairs, her face buried in her hands. When she looked up, there were tears in her eyes, but I couldn't tell if they were tears of shame, or tears of rage at being deceived. "You lied to us," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "All this time, you let us think you were struggling. You let us worry about you, try to help you, make sacrifices to support you. And you were rich the entire time." "I never lied," I said firmly. "I never claimed to be poor. I never asked for your help or support. You made assumptions based on where I chose to live and how I chose to spend my money. You decided I was struggling and needed rescuing, and you used that assumption to justify treating me like a charity case." Trevor was still processing the documents, reading through the financial statements with growing amazement. "Mom, these numbers, you could buy anything you wanted. You could live anywhere, do anything." "I am living where I want, Trevor. I am doing what I want. The difference is that now you know the choice is mine to make." I walked to the refrigerator and opened it, revealing shelves stocked with food that would have been familiar in any middle-class household. Nothing extravagant, but certainly nothing that suggested genuine poverty. "I've never been eating cat food, Chelsea. I've never been unable to afford groceries or struggling to pay my bills. Those were stories you told yourself to justify the way you've been treating me." Chelsea's tears had turned to anger, her voice rising as she stood up from the chair. "This is insane, Minnie Mae. You've been playing some kind of sick game with us, pretending to be poor while we worried about you and tried to help. What kind of person does that? The kind of person who wanted to know whether her son and daughter-in-law loved her for who she is, or for what she could provide," I said quietly. "The kind of person who had been burned before by people who changed when they learned about money." Trevor was looking at me with an expression I couldn't read, somewhere between awe and betrayal. "Mom, how could you let me worry about your future? How could you let me feel guilty about not being able to help you more? When did you worry, Trevor? When did you feel guilty?" I asked, my voice gentle but pointed. "Because from where I've been sitting, it seemed like you and Chelsea were more concerned with managing me than supporting me, more interested in controlling my choices than understanding them." The kitchen fell silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of children playing in the street outside. Three people who had thought they knew each other were discovering that they were strangers, that the relationships they had assumed were built on understanding were actually built on misperceptions and unexamined assumptions. Chelsea was the first to break the silence, her voice cold and controlled. "So what happens now, Minnie Mae? You've had your big reveal, made us all look like fools. What exactly do you want from us?" I looked at the can of cat food still sitting on the counter, then at the two people who had just offered it to me as dinner, and felt a clarity that had been building for months finally crystallize into certainty. "What I want," I said, "is for you both to leave my house. And while you're thinking about whether you want to continue being part of my life, I want you to consider whether the person you've been treating as a burden is someone you actually respect and love, or just someone you've been managing until she becomes too inconvenient to deal with." Trevor's face crumpled with what looked like genuine distress. "Mom, please, we can work this out. We can talk about this." "We just did talk about it, Trevor. You stood in my kitchen and watched your wife suggest that I eat cat food, and you defended her. You participated in a conversation about the most economical way to feed your mother, as if I were a pet you were trying to care for on a budget." I walked to the front door and opened it, the evening air carrying the scent of barbecue and the sound of laughter from the neighborhood around us. "I think you both need some time to consider who you want to be and whether that's compatible with having a relationship with me." Chelsea gathered her purse with sharp, angry movements, her face flushed with embarrassment and rage. As she passed me at the door, she turned back for one final comment. "This isn't over, Minnie Mae. There are going to be consequences for this deception. Legal consequences." I smiled at her for the first time that evening, and it was a smile that contained 43 years of building a business empire and learning to navigate corporate warfare. "My dear Chelsea, I have more lawyers on retainer than you have shoes in your closet. If you'd like to explore legal consequences, I'd be delighted to introduce you to them." After they left, I sat alone in my small kitchen, surrounded by the documents that revealed the scope of what I had built and hidden for decades. The cat food still sat on the counter, a reminder of how close I had come to losing myself entirely in their perception of who I was supposed to be. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of stepping back into my real life, of taking visible control of the empire I had built in the shadows. There would be board meetings to attend, decisions to make, and a corporate structure to reorganize now that secrecy was no longer necessary. But tonight, I was simply Minnie Mae Jackson, sitting in a small house in a working-class neighborhood, surrounded by people who valued her for her kindness rather than her bank account. The woman who had built an empire and the woman who had found genuine community in this modest place were the same person, and for the first time in years, I didn't have to choose between them. The phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was Mrs. Patterson from next door, her voice warm with neighborly concern. "Minnie Mae, honey? I saw those folks leave, looking all upset. Everything all right over there?" I looked out the window at her house, where I could see her silhouette in the kitchen window, probably preparing dinner for her own family while taking time to check on her neighbor. "Everything's perfect, Mrs. Patterson," I said, and realized I meant it completely. Everything is exactly as it should be. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of my bedroom window, casting delicate patterns across the hardwood floor that I had personally selected and paid for when I purchased this entire block through Sunset Holdings LLC. 3 days had passed since the cat food incident, and I hadn't heard a word from Trevor or Chelsea. The silence felt both liberating and heartbreaking, like the quiet that follows a storm when you're not sure if the damage can be repaired. I sat at my small kitchen table, sipping coffee from a ceramic mug that had cost me $3 at a garage sale, while reviewing quarterly reports from Jackson Premium Pet Foods that showed record-breaking profits across all product lines. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was drinking from a secondhand cup while reading about revenue figures that could have bought every garage sale item in the entire county. My phone buzzed with a text message from my assistant, Patricia Hendricks, the only person besides my legal team who knew the full extent of my involvement in the company. Patricia had been with Jackson Premium for 15 years, working her way up from receptionist to executive assistant, and she possessed a discretion that was worth its weight in gold. "Mrs. Jackson, the board meeting has been moved to Thursday at 2 p.m. Also, there's been some unusual activity regarding inquiries about your personal holdings. Should I be concerned?" I smiled as I typed back. "Nothing to worry about, Patricia. Family matters coming to light. Please schedule a full disclosure meeting with legal for Friday morning. It's time." Patricia's response came immediately. "Understood. Should I prepare the succession planning documents we discussed last year?" The succession planning documents. I had spent months working with my attorneys to create a comprehensive plan that would transfer portions of the company to Trevor when I felt he was ready to handle the responsibility. The plan included a graduated ownership structure that would give him increasing control over time, along with educational requirements and performance benchmarks designed to ensure he understood the business before inheriting it. Those documents were still sitting in my safe, unsigned and unexecuted, because I had been waiting for Trevor to demonstrate the maturity and character necessary to handle such enormous responsibility. The events of the past few days had provided a definitive answer to whether that time had come. I walked to my bedroom closet and moved aside the rack of modest clothing that served as my daily uniform. Behind the clearance rack, dresses and discount store blouses hung a single garment bag that contained the professional wardrobe I wore to board meetings and industry conferences. Tailored suits in navy and charcoal, silk blouses, and accessories that projected the authority necessary to command respect in corporate boardrooms. Most people who knew me as the grandmother next door would never recognize the woman who stepped out of that garment bag. Minnie Mae Jackson, CEO and majority owner of Jackson Premium Pet Foods, was a force to be reckoned with in the pet industry. She spoke at conferences, served on trade association boards, and had been profiled in Business Weekly as one of the most successful female entrepreneurs in the agricultural sector. But that woman had been carefully compartmentalized, appearing only when necessary and disappearing back into the shadows when business was concluded. For years, I had maintained this dual existence with the precision of a master spy, keeping my two identities so separate that even my own son had no idea who his mother really was. The deception had begun as protection and evolved into a social experiment that had yielded fascinating and heartbreaking results. By maintaining the appearance of modest means, I had discovered who in my life valued me for myself versus who saw me as a resource to be managed or exploited. The results had been illuminating and devastating in equal measure. My sister Linda, who had moved to California years ago expecting financial support, had eventually drifted away when it became clear that her poor sister Minnie couldn't fund her lifestyle ambitions. My ex-husband's family, who had ignored me completely during the difficult early years, had never attempted to reconnect because they assumed I had nothing to offer them. Old friends from my neighborhood had maintained genuine relationships based on shared experiences rather than financial calculations. But the most important test had been Trevor himself. By allowing him to believe I was financially struggling, I had hoped to see whether he would step up to support me with love and respect, or whether he would see me as a burden to be managed. The answer had been more complex and painful than I had anticipated. Trevor wasn't malicious or intentionally cruel. He was simply a young man who had been raised with privilege, even though he didn't realize the source of that privilege, and who had learned to see financial security as a measure of success and worth. When he looked at what he believed was my modest lifestyle, he saw failure rather than choice, and that perception had colored every interaction we'd had for years. My phone rang, interrupting my morning reflection. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but the area code was local. Ms. Jackson? The voice was young, female, and slightly nervous. This is Amanda Chen from the Phoenix Business Journal. I'm working on a story about successful women entrepreneurs in Arizona, and your name came up as someone I should interview. Would you be available to speak with me sometime this week? I frowned, wondering how my name had surfaced in connection with such a story. I had been extremely careful over the years to maintain a low public profile, granting interviews only to trade publications, and under circumstances that wouldn't attract general media attention. I'm sorry, Amanda, but I think there may be some confusion. I'm not sure why my name would come up in that context. Oh, I'm specifically researching Jackson Premium Pet Foods, Amanda continued. We're doing a piece on Arizona companies that have achieved national success, and Jackson Premium is one of our largest privately held corporations. I was told that Minnie Mae Jackson is the founder and CEO, but when I tried to research your background, I couldn't find much public information. A chill ran down my spine. In the 3 days since my confrontation with Trevor and Chelsea, someone had been asking questions about my business connections. Given Chelsea's parting threat about legal consequences, I suspected she had hired someone to investigate my claims about owning Jackson Premium Pet Foods. Amanda, I'm going to have to call you back, I said carefully. Can you tell me who suggested you contact me? Actually, it was kind of unusual. Someone called our newsroom yesterday claiming to have information about a major story involving corporate fraud and family deception. They said we should look into the real ownership of Jackson Premium Pet Foods and specifically mentioned your name. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Chelsea wasn't just angry about being deceived. She was attempting to discredit my claims by suggesting to the media that I was delusional or fraudulent. She was gambling that I was lying about owning the company, and she was hoping to expose what she believed was an elaborate fantasy by inviting media scrutiny. It was a miscalculation of breathtaking proportions. Amanda, I said, my voice taking on the authoritative tone I used in business negotiations, I think it would be very interesting for you to do that story. In fact, I'd like to invite you to tour our primary manufacturing facility this Thursday afternoon. I'll have my assistant, Patricia, arrange everything and provide you with full documentation of corporate ownership and financial records. The silence on the other end of the line told me that Amanda was processing the implications of my response. Someone who was perpetrating a fraud would never invite media scrutiny. Someone who was telling the truth would welcome the opportunity to set the record straight. Mrs. Jackson, are you saying that you actually do own Jackson Premium Pet Foods? I'm saying that I founded the company 43 years ago. I've served as CEO for its entire existence, and I currently hold controlling interest through a network of trusts and holding companies that we can review in detail when you visit our facilities. I'm also saying that whoever called your newsroom has made a serious error in judgment that's about to become very public. After ending the call with Amanda, I immediately called Patricia and explained the situation. Her response was swift and professional. Mrs. Jackson, I'll contact our public relations firm and have them prepare a comprehensive media package. I'll also alert our legal team about potential defamation issues if someone is making false claims about corporate fraud. Should I schedule a press conference? Not yet, Patricia. Let's see how this plays out. But yes, prepare everything we'd need for a full public disclosure. And Patricia, Make sure the legal team understands that someone may be attempting to manipulate media coverage to support false claims about the company. We need to be prepared to protect both corporate and personal interests. The next call I made was to my attorney, James Morrison, who had handled my business affairs for over 20 years. James was one of the few people who understood the full complexity of my financial structure and the reasons behind my decision to maintain anonymity. Minnie Mae, what's happening? Patricia called and said you're considering going public with your ownership of Jackson Premium. James, I need you to prepare for the possibility that someone is going to challenge my ownership claims, possibly in a very public way. I need every document, every corporate filing, every piece of evidence that establishes my founding of the company and my current controlling interest. That's not a problem. We have decades of documentation. But Minnie Mae, are you sure you want to open this door? Once your identity, as the owner of Jackson Premium, becomes public knowledge, there's no going back to your private life. I walked to my kitchen window and looked out at the neighborhood where I had found peace and genuine community. Mrs. Patterson was hanging laundry on her backyard line, while her grandchildren played in the grass nearby. Mr. Williams was working in his vegetable garden, probably preparing to share his harvest with neighbors who could use fresh produce. These people had become my friends, without knowing anything about my financial status. They valued me for my willingness to babysit their children, my contributions to neighborhood cleanup projects, and my participation in the community garden we had started behind the local elementary school. Their friendship was authentic in a way that most relationships in my previous life had not been. James, I don't want to lose what I've built here. But I also can't allow someone to publicly challenge my integrity without responding. If this becomes a media story, I want to control the narrative. Understood. I'll prepare a comprehensive package that establishes not only your ownership of Jackson Premium, but also your philanthropic activities and community involvement. We can frame this as a story about successful entrepreneurship and responsible wealth management, rather than deception or fraud. The philanthropic activities James mentioned were another aspect of my life that I had kept carefully hidden. Over the years, Jackson Premium Pet Foods had quietly funded dozens of community projects, scholarship programs, and animal welfare initiatives. The company had donated millions to animal shelters, veterinary schools, and research programs focused on pet nutrition and health. In this neighborhood alone, I had anonymously funded the renovation of the local elementary school playground, the establishment of a community center for seniors, and a microloan program that helped residents start small businesses. The scholarship fund that had paid Trevor's college tuition was just one of several educational programs I had established to help young people achieve their potential, but all of these activities had been conducted through corporate foundations and anonymous donations, maintaining the careful separation between Minnie Mae Jackson, the neighbor, and Minnie Mae Jackson, the business mogul. If I was forced to reveal my true identity, all of these relationships would change, and I wasn't sure I was prepared for that transformation. My doorbell rang, interrupting my conversation with James. Through the front window, I could see a familiar figure standing on my porch, but it wasn't Trevor or Chelsea. It was my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, holding a covered dish and wearing an expression of concern. James, I need to go. Please prepare everything we discussed and have it ready by tomorrow morning. And James, make sure our security team is aware of the situation. If someone is trying to manipulate media coverage, they might escalate to other tactics. I opened the door to find Mrs. Patterson holding a casserole dish that smelled like heaven and looking worried. Minnie Mae, honey, I hope you don't mind me dropping by, but I wanted to check on you. There was a strange woman here yesterday asking questions about you, and it made me a little nervous. My stomach dropped. What kind of questions, Mrs. Patterson? She said she was a journalist doing a story about the neighborhood, but her questions were all about you specifically. How long you'd lived here, whether you had family that visited, what kind of work you did. It didn't feel like a neighborhood story, you know? It felt like she was digging for something specific. I invited Mrs. Patterson inside and poured her a cup of coffee while she described the encounter in more detail. The woman had been well-dressed, driving an expensive car and carrying a tablet where she was taking notes. She had asked several neighbors about my financial situation, my family relationships, and whether anyone had ever questioned my background. Minnie Mae, I didn't like her attitude at all. She seemed to be looking for dirt, not writing some feel-good community piece. And when I told her you were one of the kindest, most helpful neighbors we'd ever had, she seemed disappointed, like that wasn't the answer she wanted. The description confirmed my suspicions about Chelsea's involvement. She was conducting what amounted to a private investigation, trying to gather evidence that would support her belief that I was lying about my financial status. The fact that she was questioning my neighbors suggested she was preparing for some kind of public confrontation. Mrs. Patterson, I want you to know that there may be some unusual activity around here for the next few days, some family issues that might attract attention. I hope it won't be disruptive to the neighborhood. She reached across the table and patted my hand with the kind of maternal affection that had nothing to do with social status or financial calculations. Honey, we're neighbors. Whatever's going on, you're part of this community, and we look out for each other. If someone's bothering you, they're bothering all of us. Her simple declaration of loyalty brought tears to my eyes in a way that corporate board resolutions and quarterly profit reports never had. This was what I stood to lose if my real identity became public knowledge. Not the money or the business success, but the uncomplicated relationships with people who cared about me without agenda. After Mrs. Patterson left, I spent the rest of the day preparing for what was beginning to feel like an inevitable confrontation. I reviewed corporate documents, financial statements, and legal filings that established my ownership of Jackson Premium Pet Foods beyond any possible doubt. I also prepared a personal statement explaining my reasons for maintaining anonymity and my commitment to the community where I had chosen to live. But mostly I thought about Trevor and the conversation we would eventually need to have. My son was caught in the middle of a situation he didn't fully understand. Married to a woman who was about to make a very public mistake that could humiliate their family and potentially expose them to legal consequences. Trevor had been raised with every advantage I could provide, but those advantages had been carefully disguised as middle-class normalcy. His private school education had been funded through a scholarship program I had established. His summer camps and extracurricular activities had been paid for through anonymous donations to programs that supported working families. His college tuition had come from a family trust that he believed was a small inheritance from a distant relative. He had grown up believing that his opportunities came from his own merit and hard work, which in many ways they did. But he had never understood the infrastructure of support that had made those opportunities possible, and he had never learned to appreciate the sacrifices that others make to provide advantages for their children. The irony was that I had wanted to raise him with humility and gratitude, but by hiding the source of his privileges, I had inadvertently taught him to take them for granted. He had learned to see financial struggle as a personal failure rather than a circumstance that required compassion and support. Now, at 35 years old, he was about to discover that his entire understanding of his family history was built on carefully constructed fiction. The mother he had pitied for her modest lifestyle was actually one of the most successful businesswomen in the state. The woman he had tried to help and manage was the source of every advantage he had ever enjoyed. The revelation would force him to reconsider not only his relationship with me, but his understanding of himself and his place in the world. It would challenge his assumptions about success, failure, and the responsibilities that come with privilege. As evening approached, I made one final phone call to Patricia, asking her to arrange a family meeting for Saturday morning at the Jackson Premium Pet Foods corporate headquarters. It was time for Trevor to see the full scope of what his mother had built, and to understand the choices that would define his future. Patricia, please send Trevor a formal invitation to tour the facilities and meet with the executive team. Don't mention my involvement. Just tell him that Jackson Premium Pet Foods is interested in discussing business opportunities with qualified candidates, and that his name was recommended by someone familiar with his background. Mrs. Jackson, are you sure about this approach? It seems like it might be confusing for him. Patricia, my son is about to learn that his entire life has been built on assumptions that aren't true. A little confusion might be exactly what he needs to start asking the right questions. That night, I sat in my small living room, surrounded by the modest furnishings and simple decorations that had become symbols of the authentic life I had built in this neighborhood. Tomorrow, everything would change. The secret I had maintained for decades would be revealed, and the relationships I treasured would be tested in ways I couldn't predict. But for tonight, I was still just Minnie Mae Jackson, the grandmother next door, who fed stray cats and helped her neighbors with their groceries. Tomorrow I would become someone else entirely, and I could only hope that the people who mattered would still recognize the woman they had come to love beneath the revelation of who she had always been. The transformation was inevitable now. Chelsea's attempt to expose what she believed was my deception had set in motion a chain of events that would reveal the truth to everyone. The question was whether that truth would destroy the relationships I valued most, or whether it would finally allow me to live authentically in all aspects of my life. I fell asleep that night thinking about Trevor as a little boy, helping me in the garage as I mixed the first experimental batches of pet food that would eventually become an empire. He had been so proud to be my assistant, so eager to help his mother build something important. Tomorrow he would discover that the little boy who had helped start Jackson Premium Pet Foods was now a man who had inherited more than he had ever imagined, and that the future of the company he had helped create in that modest garage was now in his hands to accept or reject. The circle was finally closing, and all the careful deceptions and protective lies were about to give way to the complicated, messy, beautiful truth of who we really were and what we meant to each other. The only question was whether Trevor would be ready to handle that truth, and whether our relationship would survive the weight of everything I had hidden in order to protect him from the burdens and privileges of the empire we had built together. The Jackson Premium Pet Foods corporate headquarters occupied 12 acres of pristine Arizona desert landscape, its glass and steel architecture gleaming against the backdrop of distant mountains. As I pulled my modest Toyota Corolla into the executive parking space that had been reserved for me for over 2 decades, I felt the familiar transformation beginning. The grandmother who had been eating breakfast from a thrift store mug an hour earlier was morphing into the CEO, who commanded one of the largest pet food empires in North America. The security guard at the main entrance smiled warmly as I approached, though visitors to the building rarely saw this level of personal recognition. "Good morning, Mrs. Jackson. Miss Hendricks is waiting for you in the executive conference room, and the legal team arrived about 10 minutes ago." I nodded my thanks and made my way through the marble-floored lobby, past the wall of awards and industry recognitions that chronicled 4 decades of business success. Employees who passed me in the hallways offered respectful greetings, though most of the newer staff members probably assumed I was just another board member or consultant. Only the senior management team knew that the modestly dressed woman walking among them was the architect of everything they saw around them. Patricia was waiting in my private office, a corner suite with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered panoramic views of the Sonoran Desert. She had laid out the documents we would need for the day's meetings, along with a fresh cup of coffee in the bone china cup that remained in this office for my exclusive use. The contrast between the luxury of this environment and the simplicity of my kitchen at home never failed to amaze me. "Mrs. Jackson, we have several developments to discuss before the legal meeting," Patricia said, her voice carrying the slight tension that indicated significant complications. "First, Amanda Chen from the Phoenix Business Journal confirmed her visit for Thursday afternoon. She's bringing a photographer and seems very interested in the human interest angle of your story." I settled into the leather chair behind my desk, the same chair where I had made decisions that affected thousands of employees and millions of customers over the years. "What else, Patricia? Your tone suggests there's more." Trevor responded to our invitation for Saturday's facility tour. "He's coming, but he's bringing Chelsea with him." He also asked several specific questions about why Jackson Premium Pet Foods would be interested in him specifically, and whether this meeting is connected to any recent family discussions. The pieces of my carefully orchestrated plan were falling into place, though Chelsea's presence would add a layer of complexity I hadn't anticipated. My daughter-in-law was walking into a trap of her own making, but she was bringing my son along as collateral damage. "There's more," Patricia continued, pulling out a folder marked with our legal department's seal. "Our investigative team has uncovered some disturbing information about Chelsea's activities over the past week. She's not just asking questions randomly. She's hired a private investigator and appears to be building a case to challenge your competency as well as your ownership claims." I opened the folder and reviewed the surveillance photos and documentation that our security team had compiled. Chelsea had indeed hired a professional investigator, someone with experience in corporate fraud cases and family disputes involving large estates. They had been systematically interviewing my neighbors, researching property records and attempting to trace the ownership structure of my various holding companies. The investigators' report, which our contacts had managed to obtain through legal channels, painted a picture of their working theory. They believed I was either suffering from delusions of grandeur brought on by age-related cognitive decline, or that I was perpetrating an elaborate fraud to manipulate my family's emotions and potentially gain access to assets that didn't belong to me. The irony was staggering. Chelsea was spending thousands of dollars to prove that I was lying about being wealthy, while simultaneously plotting to gain control of what she believed were my modest assets through competency challenges and guardianship proceedings. Patricia, they have no idea what they're walking into, do they? None whatsoever, Mrs. Jackson. Based on the investigator's report, they're expecting to expose you as a confused elderly woman who has been telling stories to get attention. They're preparing to present evidence of your modest circumstances as proof that your claims about owning Jackson Premium are delusional. The legal team arrived precisely at 9 o'clock, led by James Morrison and including specialists in corporate law, estate planning, and media relations. The conference room filled with the quiet efficiency of professionals who had been preparing for this moment for years, even though none of us had anticipated the specific circumstances that would trigger it. Minnie Mae, we've reviewed every aspect of your ownership structure and prepared comprehensive documentation that establishes your founding of Jackson Premium Pet Foods and your current controlling interest, James began, spreading documents across the polished conference table. We've also prepared responses to the specific allegations that seem to be developing, including challenges to your competency and suggestions of fraud. The media relations specialist, Sarah Chen, opened her laptop and displayed a presentation that outlined the public relations strategy we would employ once my identity became public knowledge. Mrs. Jackson, we're recommending a proactive approach that frames your story as an inspiring example of entrepreneurship and responsible wealth management. We want to emphasize your community involvement and philanthropic activities, rather than focusing on the deception aspects. I studied the slides that Sarah had prepared, noting how skillfully she had woven together the narrative threads that would transform potential scandal into admirable success story. The presentation highlighted my rise from single mother to business mogul, my commitment to maintaining community connections despite enormous wealth, and my careful stewardship of a company that had become an industry leader while maintaining ethical business practices. Sarah, what's your assessment of the potential media response? How much attention is this likely to generate? Honestly, Mrs. Jackson, this has the potential to become a significant story. Successful female entrepreneurs are always newsworthy, especially when there's an element of hidden identity involved. The fact that you've maintained anonymity for decades while building a major corporation makes this particularly compelling from a human interest perspective. The corporate communications team had also prepared responses to anticipated questions about why I had chosen to hide my success, how the company had been managed during my period of anonymity, and what my revelation would mean for Jackson Premium's future operations. Each response had been carefully crafted to emphasize positive aspects of my decision-making while avoiding any suggestion that the deception had been harmful or inappropriate. There's one more element we need to discuss, James said, his tone becoming more serious. If Chelsea and Trevor pursue legal challenges to your competency or attempt to expose what they believe is fraud, we need to be prepared for the possibility that this becomes a courtroom battle rather than just a media story. The thought of facing my own son in legal proceedings was heartbreaking, but I had learned over 4 decades of business leadership that emotional responses rarely led to good strategic decisions. If Chelsea was determined to pursue this course of action, I would respond with the full resources and legal expertise that my position afforded me. James, I want you to prepare for every possible scenario. If they want to challenge my competency, we'll submit to independent medical and psychological evaluations that will establish my mental acuity beyond question. If they want to investigate my assets, we'll provide complete financial disclosure that will demonstrate not only my ownership of Jackson Premium, but the full scope of my wealth and business interests. The meeting continued for another 2 hours, covering contingency plans for various media scenarios, legal strategies for potential family conflicts, and corporate governance issues that would arise from my transition to public ownership of the company. By the time we finished, I felt confident that we were prepared for any challenge Chelsea and Trevor might present. But preparation for business challenges was different from preparation for personal heartbreak. As I sat alone in my office after the meeting, looking out at the sprawling facility that represented my life's work, I couldn't shake the sadness that came from knowing that my relationship with Trevor would never be the same after Saturday's revelation. The intercom on my desk buzzed softly. "Mrs. Jackson, you have a visitor at the main reception desk. She says her name is Victoria Williams, and that she's your neighbor. She seems quite concerned about something." Mrs. Patterson, using her formal name, meant this was serious business. I asked security to escort her to my office immediately, wondering what could have brought her to the corporate headquarters she didn't even know I owned. When Mrs. Patterson entered my office, her eyes widened as she took in the luxurious surroundings and panoramic views. I could see her trying to reconcile the modest grandmother she knew with the executive suite where we now stood. "Minnie Mae, honey, I hope you don't mind me tracking you down like this, but something very strange happened this morning, and I was worried about you." I guided her to the comfortable seating area near the windows and asked Patricia to bring coffee while Mrs. Patterson gathered her thoughts. Her presence in this corporate environment felt surreal, like two incompatible worlds colliding in ways I had never anticipated. "Mrs. Patterson, please tell me what happened. And don't worry about the surroundings here. This is complicated, but everything will make sense soon." She pulled a business card from her purse and handed it to me with trembling fingers. The card belonged to David Richardson, private investigator, the same man whose reports I had reviewed earlier that morning in the legal meeting. This man came to my door at 8 o'clock this morning, claiming to be investigating elder abuse and financial exploitation. He said someone had reported that you were being manipulated by family members who were taking advantage of your, quote, declining mental state, and that he needed to gather evidence to protect you. The audacity of Chelsea's strategy was breathtaking. She was attempting to turn my neighbors against me by suggesting that I was a victim of elder abuse, presumably being perpetrated by some unidentified family member who was manipulating my perception of my own financial status. He asked me detailed questions about your daily routines, whether I'd noticed any changes in your behavior, and whether anyone had been pressuring you to make unusual financial decisions. He also wanted to know if you'd been claiming to own property or businesses that seemed inconsistent with your apparent income level. Mrs. Patterson's voice was growing stronger as she recounted the encounter, her protective instincts clearly aroused by what she perceived as an attack on my character. "Minnie Mae, I told that man exactly what I thought of his questions. I said you were one of the sharpest, kindest, most capable women I'd ever known, and that anyone suggesting you were being taken advantage of was either misinformed or had ulterior motives. I also told him that if he came back to our neighborhood harassing residents with these kinds of questions, I'd call the police." Her fierce defense of my character brought tears to my eyes, and I realized that the relationships I had built in that modest neighborhood were worth more than all the corporate success and financial security I had accumulated over the decades. "Mrs. Patterson, I need to tell you something that's going to sound unbelievable, but I promise it's the truth. This office, this building, this entire company belongs to me. I founded Jackson Premium Pet Foods 43 years ago, and I've been running it ever since. The modest lifestyle you know is real, but it's a choice I made, not a circumstance forced on me by financial necessity." She stared at me for several long moments, her mind clearly processing the implications of what I had just revealed. Then, to my amazement, she smiled. "Honey, I don't care if you own this building or if you're renting a room in someone's basement. You're the woman who babysits my grandchildren when I need help, who brings soup when I'm sick, and who always has time to listen when someone needs to talk. That's what matters to me." Her simple acceptance of my revelation was more validating than any corporate achievement I had ever accomplished. Mrs. Patterson wasn't impressed by my wealth or shocked by my deception. She was simply glad to know that her friend was safe and successful. "But Minnie Mae, what does this mean for the neighborhood? Are you going to move away now that this secret is coming out?" "Mrs. Patterson, that house is my home, and you are my neighbors. This revelation doesn't change what's important to me. If anything, it means I'll have more resources to help the community and support the programs that matter to all of us." We spent another hour talking about the situation, and I found myself sharing details about my business success and philanthropic activities that I had never discussed with anyone outside of professional contexts. Mrs. Patterson listened with the kind of genuine interest and pride that made me understand why the relationships in that neighborhood had become so precious to me. Before she left, Mrs. Patterson made me promise to call her if the private investigator or anyone else came around asking questions. She also insisted that I join her family for dinner on Sunday, regardless of how the upcoming confrontations with Trevor and Chelsea played out. Family is what you make it, honey. Blood doesn't make someone family, and money doesn't unmake it. You remember that when things get difficult. After Mrs. Patterson left, I spent the remainder of the afternoon reviewing operational reports and meeting with department heads who needed decisions on various business matters. The routine of corporate leadership felt familiar and reassuring after the emotional complexity of the morning's revelations. But as evening approached, I found my thoughts returning to Trevor and the meeting that would take place in 2 days. My son was walking into a situation that would challenge everything he believed about his identity and his place in the world. The successful young professional, who thought he had achieved his position through merit alone, was about to discover that his entire life had been supported by advantages he never knew existed. The revelation would be devastating for him, but it would also be liberating. For the first time, Trevor would understand the true scope of the opportunities available to him, and he would have to decide what kind of person he wanted to be with that knowledge. I drove home through the desert twilight, leaving the corporate tower where I commanded an empire, and returning to the small house where I was simply the grandmother next door. The transition between these two worlds had become second nature over the years, but I knew it was happening for the last time. After Saturday's meeting, there would be no more separation between Minnie Mae Jackson, the neighbor, and Minnie Mae Jackson, the CEO. The house felt different as I unlocked the front door, knowing that its days as a sanctuary from public scrutiny were numbered. Soon, this modest neighborhood would be flooded with media attention. Curious neighbors would discover the truth about my identity, and the simple life I had built here would be transformed into something entirely different. But as I prepared dinner in my small kitchen, using the same chipped plates and mismatched silverware that had served me for years, I felt a sense of peace about the changes that were coming. The deception that had protected me for decades had also isolated me, forcing me to live as a partial version of myself in every relationship. Tomorrow, Amanda Chen would tour the Jackson Premium facilities and learn the full story of how a single mother in a trailer park had built one of the most successful pet food companies in North America. The story would be published, and my carefully guarded privacy would disappear forever. Saturday, Trevor and Chelsea would walk into the corporate headquarters expecting to expose what they believed was my delusion, and instead, they would confront the reality of what I had built and hidden from them. The confrontation would either destroy our family relationship completely or transform it into something honest and sustainable. But tonight, I was still just Minnie Mae Jackson, sitting in a small house in a working-class neighborhood, surrounded by people who valued me for who I was rather than what I owned. Tomorrow, everything would change, but the woman who had earned their friendship and respect would remain the same, regardless of how much money she had in the bank or how many companies she owned. The phone rang just as I was finishing dinner, and Trevor's name appeared on the caller ID. My heart jumped with a mixture of hope and apprehension as I answered. "Mom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth. Chelsea has been doing some research about your claims regarding Jackson Premium Pet Foods, and she's found some things that don't make sense. Are you really involved with that company, or are you having some kind of episode we need to be concerned about?" The question was asked with the patronizing gentleness that people use when they're convinced they're dealing with someone who has lost touch with reality. Trevor genuinely believed he was helping his mother by offering her an opportunity to back down from what he assumed were delusional claims. "Trevor, I'm going to be at the Jackson Premium Pet Foods headquarters on Saturday morning for a meeting with the executive team. If you and Chelsea want answers to your questions, I suggest you keep your appointment for the facility tour. Everything will become clear then. Mom, please don't do this. If you show up at some corporate headquarters claiming to own the company, it's going to be embarrassing for everyone involved. The security people will probably call the police, and we'll have to deal with a situation that could affect your housing and your independence." I could hear Chelsea's voice in the background, coaching him on what to say next. She was still operating under the assumption that she was helping to manage a family crisis, involving an elderly woman's declining mental health. "Trevor, I understand your concern, but I need you to trust me for 2 more days. After Saturday's meeting, you'll have all the answers you need, and we can have an honest conversation about our family's future. The call ended with Trevor expressing reluctant agreement to keep the Saturday appointment, though his tone made it clear that he expected the meeting to result in my embarrassment, and possibly some kind of intervention to address my supposed mental health issues. I spent the evening packing away the modest decorations and personal items that had made this house feel like home, knowing that everything would change after Saturday's revelations. The quiet life I had built in this neighborhood was ending, but something new and potentially more authentic was about to begin. As I prepared for bed, I looked around the small bedroom that had been my sanctuary for years, filled with simple furnishings and sentimental objects that reflected the life of a modest grandmother. Tomorrow, I would begin the transformation back into the corporate executive who commanded respect in boardrooms and industry conferences. The woman who went to sleep in that modest bedroom was the same woman who would wake up as the CEO of Jackson Premium Pet Foods, but the world's perception of her was about to change dramatically. The question was whether the people who mattered most would be able to see past the revelation of her wealth to the authentic person who had been hiding in plain sight all along. Saturday morning would bring the end of one chapter and the beginning of another, and I could only hope that the truth would prove stronger than the comfortable lies that had sustained us for so many years. Saturday morning arrived with the crisp clarity that only Arizona winter can provide, the desert air so clean it seemed to amplify every sound and sharpen every detail. I stood in front of my bedroom mirror, adjusting the navy blue Armani suit that I hadn't worn in 6 months, watching myself transform from neighborhood grandmother into corporate executive. The woman looking back at me was someone Trevor had never met, though she was the same person who had raised him from infancy. Patricia had arrived at 7:30 to brief me on the final arrangements for what we had privately begun calling the revelation. The Jackson Premium Pet Foods Executive Conference Room had been prepared with comprehensive displays documenting the company's 43-year history, from the first experimental batches mixed in my trailer park kitchen to the current international distribution network spanning 14 countries. The security team had been instructed to treat Trevor and Chelsea as VIP guests, while maintaining discreet surveillance of their reactions and any attempts to record or photograph proprietary information. Amanda Chen from the Phoenix Business Journal would arrive at 10 o'clock for her interview and facility tour, followed by Trevor and Chelsea at 11:30 for what they believed would be a brief meeting about potential business opportunities. I had spent most of the night rehearsing what I would say to my son when he finally understood the scope of what his mother had built and hidden from him. How do you explain 4 decades of deception to someone you love? How do you reveal that their entire understanding of their family history has been carefully constructed fiction designed to protect them from burdens they never knew existed? The drive to the corporate headquarters felt different this morning, weighted with the knowledge that this would be the last time I made this journey as someone living a double life. After today, Minnie Mae Jackson would be a public figure, her privacy sacrificed on the altar of truth, and her quiet neighborhood existence transformed into something entirely different. Amanda Chen was waiting in the lobby when I arrived, her photographer already capturing images of the awards wall and corporate displays that chronicled Jackson Premium's rise to industry prominence. She was younger than I had expected, probably in her early 30s, with the eager intensity of a journalist who sensed she was about to uncover a significant story. Mrs. Jackson, thank you so much for agreeing to this interview. I have to admit, when I started researching your company, I never expected to find such a compelling personal story behind the corporate success. I led Amanda and her photographer through the facility, starting with the research and development laboratories, where teams of food scientists and veterinary nutritionists worked to perfect formulas that would keep millions of pets healthy and happy. The tour continued through the quality control facilities, the manufacturing floors, and the distribution centers that coordinated shipments to retailers across 3 continents. At each stop, Amanda asked detailed questions about my role in founding and developing the company, clearly fascinated by the story of a single mother who had built a major corporation while maintaining complete anonymity for decades. Her photographer captured images of me in various corporate settings, creating visual documentation of a business leader whose existence had been carefully hidden from public view. Mrs. Jackson, Help me understand why you chose to keep your success secret for so many years. Most entrepreneurs at your level of achievement seek publicity and recognition for their accomplishments. We were sitting in my executive office, the photographer capturing images of me behind the desk, where I had made decisions affecting thousands of employees and millions of customers. The question was one I had been expecting, and I had prepared an answer that was truthful without being overly personal. Amanda, I learned early in my business career that visible wealth changes relationships in ways that aren't always positive. People begin to see you as an opportunity rather than a person, and family dynamics can become complicated when money enters the equation. I wanted to maintain authentic relationships based on who I am, rather than what I own. The interview continued for over an hour, covering my business philosophy, my approach to corporate leadership, and my vision for Jackson Premium's future growth. Amanda was clearly impressed by the scope of what I had accomplished, but she was also intrigued by the personal sacrifices involved in maintaining such elaborate secrecy. There's one more aspect of this story that I'd like to explore, Amanda said as we concluded the formal interview portion of her visit. I understand that your family only recently learned about your business success. How have they responded to these revelations? The question touched on the most painful aspect of the entire situation, and I found myself choosing my words carefully to protect Trevor's privacy while acknowledging the complexity of our family dynamics. Family relationships are always complicated, Amanda. When you've maintained secrets for decades, even secrets designed to protect the people you love, the revelation of truth can be challenging for everyone involved. I'm hopeful that we'll work through these issues together. As Amanda and her photographer prepared to leave, she mentioned that the story would be published in the following week's edition of the Phoenix Business Journal, with additional coverage planned by other regional publications that had picked up on the story. The quiet life I had built in my modest neighborhood was about to become very public indeed. Patricia escorted Amanda from the building while I prepared for the more difficult meeting that was about to begin. Through my office windows, I could see Trevor's BMW pulling into the visitor parking area, followed closely by what I assumed was the private investigator Chelsea had hired to document what they expected would be my embarrassing exposure as a delusional elderly woman. The security team had been briefed to allow the investigator to accompany Trevor and Chelsea, but to monitor his activities closely and prevent any unauthorized recording or photography. If Chelsea wanted to document my supposed humiliation, she would have to rely on her own observations rather than professional surveillance equipment. I took the elevator down to the main lobby, arriving just as Trevor and Chelsea were being processed by security for their visitor badges. My son looked uncomfortable in his best suit, clearly dreading what he expected would be an awkward confrontation with corporate executives, who would have to explain to his delusional mother that she didn't own their company. Chelsea, however, looked confident and almost triumphant, her expensive handbag clutched tightly as if it contained evidence that would expose my claims as elaborate fiction. The private investigator she had brought stood discreetly near the entrance, his camera bag suggesting he was prepared to document whatever embarrassing scene was about to unfold. Trevor, Chelsea, welcome to Jackson Premium Pet Foods, I said, approaching them with the professional courtesy I used with all corporate visitors. I'm looking forward to showing you our facilities and discussing some exciting opportunities. Trevor's eyes widened slightly as he took in my appearance, clearly surprised by the authoritative presence I projected in this corporate environment. The modest grandmother he knew seemed to have transformed into someone entirely different, though he couldn't yet process the implications of what he was seeing. Mom, what exactly is happening here? The security people are treating you like you work here, and that woman from the front desk called you Mrs. Jackson like she knows you personally. All of your questions will be answered shortly, Trevor. But first, let me give you the tour that was promised when we scheduled this meeting. I led them through the same route I had taken with Amanda Chen, though this time the experience was entirely different. Instead of explaining the company's history to an interested journalist, I was revealing my life's work to family members, who had spent years pitying me for what they perceived as my modest circumstances and limited opportunities. At each stop along the tour, I provided detailed explanations of the business operations, the technological innovations, and the market strategies that had made Jackson Premium Pet Foods a leader in its industry. I could see Trevor becoming increasingly confused as he processed the depth of my knowledge about corporate operations that should have been completely foreign to his supposedly struggling mother. Chelsea, meanwhile, was growing visibly agitated as the tour progressed. Her confident expectation that I would be exposed as delusional was being replaced by the uncomfortable suspicion that something was happening that she didn't understand. The private investigator followed at a discreet distance, his camera remaining unused, as he tried to assess a situation that was clearly not developing according to his client's expectations. The tour concluded in the executive conference room, where Patricia had prepared displays documenting the complete corporate history of Jackson Premium Pet Foods. The walls were covered with photographs, newspaper clippings, industry awards, and financial charts that told the story of a company's growth from a single mother's kitchen experiment to an international corporation. "Trevor, Chelsea, please have a seat," I said, gesturing toward the polished conference table where board meetings were held and major corporate decisions were made. "I think it's time we had an honest conversation about your mother's financial situation." Trevor was staring at a photograph from 1985 that showed me receiving an industry award for innovative pet nutrition research. His face reflected the dawning realization that the woman in the photograph was unmistakably his mother, though she was being recognized for accomplishments he had never known existed. "Mom, I don't understand what's happening here. How do you know so much about this company? Why do all these people treat you like you belong here?" I walked to the head of the conference table and opened the folder containing the corporate ownership documents that would answer his questions definitively. For 43 years, I had protected Trevor from the knowledge of what I had built. Now it was time for him to understand the full scope of his inheritance and the responsibilities that came with it. "Trevor, I founded Jackson Premium Pet Foods 43 years ago in the kitchen of our trailer in Bakersfield. You were 2 years old, and I was a single mother trying to figure out how to support us both. What started as a way to help our neighbor's sick dog became a business that now employs over 2,000 people and generates annual revenues exceeding $400 million. I placed the ownership documents in front of him, watching as he read the legal language that established my controlling interest in the corporation he was sitting inside. His hands were shaking slightly as he processed the implications of what he was seeing. "The Jackson Premium Pet Foods that you've been touring for the past hour belongs to me, Trevor. I built it, I own it, and I've been running it for your entire life. Every advantage you've ever had, every opportunity that's been available to you, has been funded by the success of this company." Chelsea had gone completely pale, her earlier confidence replaced by what appeared to be a mixture of shock and horror. The wealthy mother-in-law she had been systematically humiliating was actually one of the most successful businesswomen in the state, and her attempts to expose supposed delusions had backfired spectacularly. "The private investigator you hired to prove that I was lying about owning this company has actually been documenting the accuracy of my claims," I continued, looking directly at Chelsea. "Every property record he's researched, every corporate filing he's examined, every financial document he's traced, has confirmed that I am exactly who I said I was." Trevor was still staring at the ownership documents, his voice barely above a whisper when he finally spoke. "Mom, if this is all true, if you really own this company, then why have you been living like you're struggling? Why did you let us think you needed our help?" The question I had been dreading had finally been asked, and I found myself searching for words that could explain decades of decisions without destroying what remained of our relationship. "Trevor, I maintained a modest lifestyle because I wanted to know who you would become without the pressures and temptations that come with enormous wealth. I wanted you to develop your own character, your own values, your own sense of purpose, before you learned about the advantages that would be available to you." I walked to the window overlooking the manufacturing facility where hundreds of employees were working to fulfill orders that would feed millions of pets across the world. I also wanted to know whether the people in my life loved me for who I am, or for what I could provide them. The past few years have given me very clear answers to that question. Chelsea finally found her voice, though it was tight with anger and embarrassment. "You've been lying to us for years, Minnie Mae. You let us worry about your finances, try to help you, make sacrifices to support what we thought was your fixed income. That's not protection, that's manipulation. I never asked for your help, Chelsea. I never claimed to be struggling or unable to afford my lifestyle. You made assumptions based on where I chose to live and how I chose to spend my money. And you used those assumptions to justify treating me as if I were incompetent to manage my own affairs. I returned to the conference table and sat across from them, my voice taking on the firm tone I used in difficult business negotiations. What you've been calling help has felt much more like condescension and control. The suggestion that I eat cat food wasn't about economics, Chelsea. It was about putting me in my place, reducing me to something less than human in your eyes. Trevor was looking back and forth between Chelsea and me, clearly struggling to reconcile his understanding of recent events with the revelations about my true financial status. The son who had stood silently while his wife humiliated his mother was now faced with the reality that the woman he had pitied was actually the source of everything he had taken for granted. Mom, I don't know what to say. If what you're telling us is true, then everything I thought I knew about our family is wrong. Everything I believed about my own achievements, my own success, has been built on advantages I didn't know I had. The pain in his voice was exactly what I had feared when I made the decision to reveal the truth. Trevor was discovering that his understanding of himself had been built on incomplete information, and that discovery was forcing him to question every accomplishment he had thought was his own. Trevor, your achievements are your own. The education you received, the work ethic you developed, the character you've shown, those things came from you. The fact that I was able to provide opportunities doesn't diminish what you did with them. Patricia entered the conference room with a tablet containing the succession planning documents I had prepared months earlier. The papers that would transfer significant portions of Jackson Premium Pet Foods to Trevor, along with the responsibilities and expectations that would come with that inheritance. There's something else we need to discuss, I said, opening the folder that contained Trevor's future. The reason I have finally revealed the truth about my business success is that I need to make decisions about the company's future leadership. I'm 67 years old, and it's time to begin transferring control to the next generation. I placed the succession documents in front of Trevor, watching as he read the legal language that would make him a major shareholder in one of the most successful privately held corporations in the pet food industry. These documents would transfer 40% ownership of Jackson Premium Pet Foods to you immediately, with the remainder to be transferred over the next 10 years as you demonstrate readiness to assume full corporate leadership. The transfer includes not just ownership but active participation in management and strategic decision-making. Trevor's eyes widened as he processed the financial implications of what I was offering. 40% of a company worth over $300 million represented wealth beyond anything he had ever imagined, along with responsibilities that would transform his entire life. But Trevor, this inheritance comes with conditions that reflect the values I've tried to instill in you throughout your life. You would be required to maintain the company's commitment to ethical business practices, employee welfare, and community involvement. You would also be expected to continue the philanthropic activities that have been supported through corporate foundations. I paused, looking directly at both Trevor and Chelsea as I delivered the most important condition of the inheritance. And you would be required to demonstrate respect and consideration for family members, regardless of their apparent financial circumstances. The way you've treated me over the past few years suggests that you might not be ready for the responsibilities that come with this level of wealth and influence. The conference room fell silent as Trevor absorbed the magnitude of what was being offered and what was being required. The inheritance that could transform his life was contingent on his ability to become the kind of person who deserved such responsibility. Chelsea was the first to break the silence, her voice sharp with the desperation of someone whose carefully laid plans had collapsed completely. This is insane, Trevor. She's been playing games with us for years, manipulating our emotions and testing us like laboratory rats. How can you trust anything she says after discovering she's been lying about who she is? Trevor looked at his wife with an expression I had never seen before, as if he were seeing her clearly for the first time. The woman who had convinced him to treat his mother with condescension was now revealing her own character through her response to learning about my success. Chelsea, she wasn't lying about who she is. She was protecting herself from people who would treat her differently if they knew about her money. Based on how we've been acting lately, I think she was smart to be careful about who she trusted. The transformation in Trevor's voice was remarkable. The uncertain young man who had entered the conference room was being replaced by someone who was beginning to understand the complexity of adult relationships and the responsibilities that come with privilege. Mom, I need to apologize for how I've been treating you. I thought I was helping, but looking back, I can see that I was being patronizing and controlling. I was so focused on what I thought you needed that I never asked what you actually wanted." His words represented the first genuine acknowledgement of my autonomy that I had heard from him in years. The son who had seen me as a burden to be managed was beginning to recognize me as a person with my own agency and decision-making capacity. "I don't know if I'm ready for the kind of responsibility you're talking about," Trevor continued, looking at the succession documents with something approaching awe. "But I want to learn. I want to understand what you've built here and figure out how to be worthy of inheriting it." Chelsea was staring at Trevor as if he had become a stranger, clearly realizing that her husband was slipping away from the dynamic she had worked so hard to establish. The man who had followed her lead in treating his mother as incompetent was now expressing respect and admiration for achievements she had tried to discredit. "Trevor, you can't seriously be considering this. She's been deceiving us for years, and now she's trying to buy your forgiveness with promises of inheritance. This whole situation is manipulative and probably illegal." Trevor turned to face Chelsea directly, his voice calm but firm. "Chelsea, the only manipulation I see here is what we've been doing to my mother. We decided she was helpless and needed our management, and we used that assumption to justify treating her like a child. Finding out that she's actually incredibly successful doesn't change the fact that our behavior was wrong." The private investigator Chelsea had brought was standing near the conference room door, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the confrontation had taken. His client had hired him to document evidence of an elderly woman's delusions, but instead he was witnessing a family reckoning that had nothing to do with mental competency and everything to do with respect and character. I stood up from the conference table and walked to the window again, looking out at the facility that represented 4 decades of hard work and careful planning. The empire I had built in secret was finally being revealed to the people who mattered most, and their responses were teaching me everything I needed to know about their character. "Trevor, I'm not trying to buy your forgiveness or manipulate your emotions. I'm offering you the opportunity to continue building something meaningful, but only if you can demonstrate that you're the kind of person who deserves that opportunity." I turned back to face them, my voice carrying the authority that came from decades of successful leadership. "The inheritance I'm describing isn't just money, Trevor. It's responsibility for the livelihoods of thousands of employees, for the welfare of millions of pets, and for the continued success of a company that has become a leader in its industry. If you're going to accept that responsibility, you need to prove that you can treat people with dignity and respect, regardless of their apparent circumstances." Trevor nodded slowly, clearly understanding that this was about much more than financial inheritance. The conversation was about what kind of man he wanted to be, and whether he was ready to live up to the example his mother had set through decades of hard work and principled decision-making. "Mom, what do I need to do to prove that I'm ready for this responsibility?" The question represented everything I had hoped to hear from him. Instead of focusing on what he would receive, Trevor was asking what he needed to give. Instead of demanding inheritance as a right, he was acknowledging that it needed to be earned. "You need to start by rebuilding the relationships you've damaged through your recent behavior. You need to apologize to the neighbors you've patronized, to acknowledge the community you've dismissed, and to demonstrate that you can see value in people regardless of their economic status." I looked directly at Chelsea, whose face was flushed with anger and embarrassment. "And you need to decide whether your marriage is compatible with the kind of person you need to become. Someone who encourages you to treat family members with contempt is not someone who will help you handle the responsibilities that come with significant wealth." The ultimatum was implicit but clear. Trevor would need to choose between the inheritance I was offering and the relationship dynamic that Chelsea had established. He couldn't have both, because the values they represented were fundamentally incompatible. Chelsea stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the polished floor of the conference room. "This is ridiculous, Trevor. She's asking you to choose between your wife and her money. That's emotional blackmail, and it's exactly the kind of manipulation I've been warning you about." Trevor remained seated, looking at the succession documents with growing understanding of what they represented. "Chelsea, she's not asking me to choose between you and money. She's asking me to choose between being the kind of person who deserves respect and being the kind of person who treats his mother like a burden." The clarity in his voice surprised me. The son, who had seemed so confused and conflicted, was suddenly articulating the moral dimensions of the situation with remarkable precision. I've been thinking about what happened with the cat food, Trevor continued, his voice growing stronger. I stood in Mom's kitchen and watched you suggest that she eat pet food because it was more economical than human food. I didn't defend her dignity, I didn't challenge your assumptions, and I didn't recognize how cruel that suggestion was. He looked up at me with tears in his eyes. Mom, I'm ashamed of the man I've been lately. I'm ashamed that I let someone convince me to see you as a problem to be solved instead of a person to be respected. I want to do better. Chelsea gathered her purse and turned toward the door, her voice cold with fury. Fine, Trevor. Choose your mother's money over your marriage. But don't expect me to stick around and watch you pretend to be something you're not. Trevor watched his wife leave the conference room, followed by the private investigator who clearly recognized that his services were no longer needed. When the door closed behind them, we were left alone with the weight of everything that had been said and everything that had been revealed. Mom, I think my marriage might be over, Trevor said quietly, and I think that might be for the best. I returned to my seat at the conference table, feeling a mixture of sadness for his pain and relief that he was finally seeing clearly. Trevor, I never wanted to destroy your marriage. I wanted to know whether it was built on values that could support the kind of life you're capable of living. We spent the next 2 hours discussing the practical aspects of the inheritance, the corporate responsibilities he would be assuming, and the timeline for his transition into active leadership of Jackson Premium Pet Foods. Trevor asked thoughtful questions about business operations, employee relations, and the philanthropic commitments that were an integral part of the company's mission. By the time we finished our conversation, I was confident that my son was ready to begin the process of earning the inheritance he would eventually receive. More importantly, I was confident that he was ready to become the kind of person who deserved that inheritance. As we prepared to leave the corporate headquarters, Trevor asked one final question that revealed how much his perspective had changed in the course of a single morning. Mom, are you going to stay in the neighborhood, or are you going to move somewhere that reflects your actual financial status? I smiled at the question, recognizing that he was beginning to understand the difference between choosing modesty and being forced into it by circumstances. Trevor, that house is my home, and those people are my neighbors. My financial status doesn't change the relationships I've built or the community I've become part of. If anything, my resources will allow me to do more to support the programs and people that matter to me. 3 months later, I stood in my small kitchen, preparing Sunday dinner for Mrs. Patterson's extended family, Trevor, and several other neighbors who had become integral parts of my chosen family. The modest house that had served as my sanctuary during the years of secrecy had become the gathering place for a community that valued authenticity over appearances. Trevor had moved into a small apartment after his divorce, choosing to downsize his lifestyle while he learned the business and proved his readiness for greater responsibility. He spent his evenings and weekends in the neighborhood, helping with community projects and rebuilding relationships that had been damaged by his earlier condescension. The Phoenix Business Journal story had generated significant media attention, but the focus had been largely positive, emphasizing my commitment to community involvement and responsible business practices. Several other publications had followed up with features about successful entrepreneurs who maintained modest lifestyles despite enormous wealth. Jackson Premium Pet Foods had benefited from the publicity, with increased consumer interest in products from a company led by someone who understood the value of authenticity and community connection. The corporate succession plan was proceeding smoothly, with Trevor demonstrating remarkable aptitude for business leadership and genuine commitment to the company's values. But the most important outcome of the revelation had been the transformation of my relationship with Trevor. The son who had seen me as a burden had become a man who sought my advice and valued my wisdom. The family dynamic based on condescension and management had been replaced by one built on mutual respect and genuine affection. As I watched Trevor helping Mrs. Patterson's grandchildren with their homework while dinner finished cooking, I realized that the cat food incident that had triggered this entire chain of events had been a blessing in disguise. It had forced me to choose between maintaining comfortable lies and embracing difficult truths, and the choice had ultimately led to the authentic relationships I had always wanted. The empire I had built in secret was no longer a source of isolation and deception. It had become a foundation for supporting the community I loved and providing opportunities for the next generation to build something even better. The woman who had started mixing pet food in a trailer park kitchen had finally found a way to live authentically in all aspects of her life, and the future looked brighter than anything she could have imagined when this journey began. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.